Walking the serpentine path, following the footsteps of the ancestors. Walking the serpentine path, making our way back home. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho, hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, ho. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho. Following the serpentine path. Life. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Serpentine Path podcast. My name is Claire Waudia Seed, and I'm a plant walker, song keeper, word weaver, artesana, visual and performance artist, womb wisdom keeper, and your guide on this serpentine path of life. Together, we'll dive deep into all things related to plant medicine, ancestral reconnection, intergenerational healing, womb sovereignty and bodily autonomy, rites of passage and initiation, time travel, shape-shifting, dimension hopping, the reclamation of our collective earth-based practices, and the ongoing, never-ending cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Welcome to the serpentine path where the ancestors have called us back to. Let's start at the end and find our way back home together. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Serpentine Path podcast. I am very excited to welcome a beautiful guest onto the show, Kasia Stiggelbout. Thank you so much for being here and for being open to this conversation.
I'm so happy to be here. I feel like our very open-hearted time right before this, where we prepped, really set the stage so well. I wish the audience could have been part of that. That was so beautiful.
I always feel that way. Like every time I feel like the podcast starts the second that we get on. And there's always multiple moments in that introduction where we're speaking where I'm like, this needs to be recorded. But I also appreciate the privacy and the intimacy that we get to share together. And it always does interweave its way in, right? Like that medicine and the energetics that we're creating beforehand does absolutely guide the path. So yeah, I'm very grateful to have connected and I'm very grateful to see what comes. So usually, I love to start off by asking my guests this opening question because this podcast is so deep about ancestral reverence and bringing those ancestral technologies forward into what we're doing now in these timelines that we're living. So, if your ancestors were here with you now, because of course they always are, how would they introduce you and what role would they say that you play in your family lineage?
Mm, I love this question. It is by far the most original question that I've really ever heard or been asked, by the way. So, just such a good one. I'm thinking about my immediate ancestors who I met, my grandparents on both sides. And I feel as though, and I'm kind of reflecting on things that especially my grandpa, who I was very, very close to, used to say that each of us kids, I'm one of three, that we all had kind of our roles to play, so to speak. My middle brother in Polish, he was a word called kumpel, which means friend. My youngest brother was the professor. Um, and I was always kind of put out there as the leader of that group. And it's kind of a weird word to put out there because I think in many ways I resonate with it. Depending on how I'm feeling about myself that day or what's going on, I might feel more or less connected to it. But I definitely think that in many ways, being the first daughter born to an immigrant family here in the United States, I feel like I am paving the way. I'm paving the way for many things, even in terms of healing some stuff that I carried with me through my matriarchal lineage and belief systems from Eastern Europe that I do think are no longer going to be passed down through me. So, yeah, I guess that would be the word that I know would come up that comes up for me.
It's beautiful. And it's something that I was actually talking about with a friend who's going to come on the podcast. I think next week I'm interviewing him, is being in a very strange time right now in humanity, in understanding that all of the generations that came before us had very specific roles to play and very, very specific work to do. And most of that was like survival, right? And so many of us cross-culturally around the world are emerging from a time of coming from an ancestral period where there was like just profound strife and suffering and war and genocide and echoes of colonization, and arriving at this place now where those things are certainly still alive, but there's also more spaciousness for us to begin doing some really, really deep lineage cleaning, right? And I feel like a lot of the people who come onto this show take on similar roles in their families, but in their communities as well. And it can be a strange place to be in where you're like, I'm so grateful for everything that my ancestors did, and also like, wow, they passed on a lot of stuff to me that I have to clean up, for myself and for my whole lineage, and to find peace and to find surrender and to find serenity. And the word leadership, when you said it, I was like, yeah, actually, like no one has said that yet. Any of my guests, a lot of them have said like, I'm the rememberer, or I'm the person who like is bringing it back but bringing it forward and all of that. And leadership feels like a huge part of it that I actually think is missing from a lot of people right now. I think that there's a big, big emphasis on like following elders, which is incredibly important. And like kind of knowing your place and knowing your lineage and like working your way up. But then there's also this thing of like, well, then when do you take on the responsibility of leadership? Like, when do you really hold that in yourself? When do you really recognize that in yourself and in your path? And so I love that you said that. I think it's really beautiful.
Thank you. And I love this question, actually. As I was hearing you speak about some past guests and just even reflecting on how profound this question is, it's interesting because right before we hopped on and started recording, you put out a beautiful intention that included calling in the voices and presence of past ancestors from both of our sides. And it's actually quite wild to think that I don't spend enough time like reflecting on my ancestors. When I say ancestors, also really ancestors that are even living, right? And I bring this up because I think this question is so important and so relevant. A lot of us, I will speak for myself and for my friend group, I feel like we've become more disconnected from our lineages like I have several friends who, um, you know, are unfortunately estranged from parents. And in some cases, that is so necessary, especially, of course, if abuse has taken place. But it's just so incredible to think about all of the people that had to exist for us to exist today and to have reverence for that. And then, I'm just even having a moment to reflect on, my parents are a part of that too. And sometimes those relationships can be so tense. And so I love that you asked this question, and it makes me immediately think like, what has it been like for, and I know I'm being interviewed, but I'm just curious, like, what has it been like for you to flip the script on that like family relationship? Because I think I cannot be alone in, there is so much quote unquote healing that needs to happen, but how do we not throw out the baby with the bathwater and discard our ancestry? Because in that healing, a lot of the time we're setting boundaries with our parents or grandparents who introduced these habits in us. And so I'm just curious, like, what that looks like for you, especially somebody who sits with so many elders and now is asking these types of questions.
It's so funny. Okay, for people who don't know, Kasia also has her own podcast, and so she's showing you her interview skills right now, and she's great. No, it's something that I'm always really investigating in myself, my relationship to my ancestors, and being a person of purely European descent. My lineage is not mixed with any indigenous lineage from the so-called Americas, from Africa, from Asia, Oceania, any of that. And recognizing the damage that has been done to my own spirit and to my family and to um, my community of people who would be called white. I don't really refer to myself as white anymore. Just after like a lot of unraveling that I've done around race, being in the jungle for so long and spending so much time with Indigenous people and having really different perspectives being introduced into my ideas of like, what does this skin tone mean? And a huge part of my healing has been learning from elders who still have intact lineages and cultures where even even when they speak about elders who maybe did really crazy stuff, like who were doing straight up spiritual warfare, who were like killing a lot of people, both as like a form of defense and like not, and the realities of what human beings are capable of and what we do, and the understandings that we've all lived on every side of the colonizer and oppressor and slave trader and enslaved and colonized and oppressed spectrum, seeing that with my elders and hearing them speak really openly, about the light and the dark of what it is to be a human brought me a lot of peace with my ancestors. And I was just kind of like, okay, like if I am so cut off to you, because I hate you and because I'm ashamed of you and because I'm guilty and because I just hold like these lies of whiteness in my spirit, I'm also blocking my blessings from you. I'm blocking my gifts. I'm blocking all of the wisdom that you carry. I come from a very, very long line of healers on both sides of my family tree. And those are people who were medical doctors and who lived in the Western paradigm for the past, couple generations. But before that, they were folk healers. They were medicine men. They were medicine women. And to not open space in my heart for them to be available um, is not only a disservice to me, but it's a disservice to my lineage because it keeps my ancestors trapped as well. And it keeps them in a spiral of shame and it keeps their spirits distorted and twisted. And I know that that's not the full story of who they are, in the same way that I've done a lot of really crazy shit in my life. I've done a lot of whack stuff. I've hurt a lot of people, mostly myself. And to know that that also isn't the truth of who I am too. And so it's that ongoing process of forgiving myself and forgiving my ancestors and forgiving my family and forgiving my parents, my sisters, forgiving my future children for any crazy stuff that they're gonna do, just really being in this place of like, okay, like I think that's the big sickness of whiteness is like the inability to really um hold forgiveness and to hold conflict without totally cutting one another off in the way that you were speaking to of like totally estranged, no contact, like all of that. I did that for a long time with my family, actually. And it was necessary, but it didn't bring me the healing that I needed.
That's so good. I mean, that's powerful medicine. I think that the forgiveness and forgiveness doesn't mean not having accountability either. Like I just want to name that because you said that so eloquently, right? Like where we can forgive and choose to, of course, make different choices in the future for our current kind of life and the lives that come and set that example. But I just think that that's so powerful. I think, yeah, I haven't ever heard it described like that. That's really, really, really powerful. I love that.
Yeah, thank you for asking. And I think I was just thinking, I was like, how is this going to weave into everything else we're talking about? And then I was like, wait, duh, of course it does, because what we're going to go into a lot in this conversation are the things that you speak so eloquently about and that you have really shifted your work towards, which is female reproductive health, the female hormonal matrix, being at peace in our wombs, in our femininity. With that also comes being able to like trust our bodies, being able to trust men, being able to be in right relationship with the people that we love, right? And so much of that, our current like health conundrum as women is deeply ancestral, like goes to like the root of our bodies, of so much pain and trauma that women have gone through cross-culturally around the world, but certainly European or women of European descent, those who have stayed in Europe, those who have come to the United States or, this hemisphere. And so I feel like it's a beautiful thing to dive deep into and to keep in the consciousness throughout the rest of this interview is just kind of like everything that we're going to be talking about actually isn't new information, one. Two, there are things that were very much lost to a lot of our lineages, particularly women of European descent. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I don't know how much we'll get into that in this conversation, but I'm feeling a lot of fire in me, and I'm also feeling a lot of grief and a lot of sadness and the weight of how deep this healing goes when we start listening to our wombs, right? And we start listening to our bodies. So yeah, I'd love to just give you space to share a little bit about your journey and where you come from and how you've gotten to where you are now and what you orient towards and as much as you would love to share. I'm excited to hear.
Oh my gosh, what an introduction right there. That was beautiful. Ah, well, where to even begin? First of all, I feel like I am on a journey coming back to myself and coming back home, which is really, really beautiful, right? So when we talk about, well, how did you get to where we are, where you are? Well, where I am feels more like home now than ever, but it was definitely a very long and windy journey because, I kind of shared at the beginning, we talked about my background. I come from the parents, two parents who are immigrants, born into a world at the time that was very, very filled with a lot of scarcity. My parents came here for the American dream. My dad was a serial entrepreneur where we've had waves of like, we were doing well and then we had nothing and then well and then nothing. And like that was just really something that felt very embodied in my life from a very young age. And with that with that scarcity, I think came a lot of constriction from a very young age to constrict, control, mind over feelings. When I kind of think about stepping into the world after I graduated from school. I went to college. I mean, even while I was in school, my number one goal was to become independent because there was so much instability in my life, and you tailor that with also some of the times that I was growing up in. My mom, she was an engineer by trade, but she was a stay-at-home mom in a very traditional European relationship. So my dad was really the man in power. My mom, I love her so dearly, but she definitely fit into the molds of a Eastern European wife, which was slightly subservient in those times. And I think that that really molded a lot of belief systems within me, right? That stability, most important thing. Number two, never rely on anybody else. My mom really emphasized how important independence was from a very, very young age. And that became my driving force. And it's interesting because the habits that I embodied from those belief systems really did make me, for a very long period of time, objectively successful on paper, but at the cost of my health entirely. So I graduated from school. I started working immediately. I was even working in school. So I just like flowed from part time to full time. And over a decade, climbed the corporate ladder from working in publishing to marketing to tech, organizing TED events, worked at Microsoft leading software teams. And even though objectively on paper, I found myself thriving, quote unquote, air quotes here, from a health point of view, I was totally, totally struggling. I had debilitating endometriosis. I still have endometriosis. It's not something that can go away, but has by and large gone through periods of remission, which is amazing. It's a hormonal slash inflammatory autoimmune condition. And I also had full body eczema through periods of burnout. And it wasn't, I wish I could say that it was just that one flare that really got me to see things differently, but it was just these subsequent breakdowns at the peaks of my success, so to speak, that eventually just led me to really, really having to rethink the things that I valued and what I was working towards. And in 2021, I left my decade long career in tech to completely start over and study Chinese medicine. I went to grad school. And I wish I could say that leaving the environment completely overhauled my perspective, but it didn't. I took those same habits, transitioning from a very systematic, linear way of working and thinking and simply applied that to a completely different environment. And it was kind of year one or two of grad school that I started to think that, hey, perhaps the common denominator isn't just what I'm doing or where I'm doing it, but it's something deeper. It has to do with the way that I'm operating and the beliefs that I have and how I am thinking about my body, well being, productivity, creativity, and being forced to kind of see my burnout through a completely different lens just really opened the door for me to seeing that as a woman there is a different way that I can lean into operating, and that B, when I lean into that way of being and functioning, which I would like to say is really womb led, that can change everything. Not just productivity, which is something that I spend a lot of time talking about now, which is like feminine productivity, but really relationship to self, my body, relationships with partners, that there is a missing link that we as women, missing potential in all areas of our lives that we as women are missing out on. And that was really like an aha moment for me. So that was like a long-winded story of coming home, really.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. And it's, I think so many women can relate to that arc, right? Unfortunately, it's because we get to that point of burnout and we get to that point of a lot of the time like health crises, right? And it's funny because I have such a different path. I've never done anything corporate. I've never worked like a desk job or a day job like that. I mean, I've had like my little side hustles, but I'm like a weird, artist, traveler, whatever I do in my life. Um, and still, I have the exact same programming where everything I did, I was just like, go for it, and burnt myself out with everything that I did. It didn't matter what I was doing. Like there was just this drive within me that is very deeply ingrained in like my cells coming from a strong lineage of like second wave feminists and just our modern culture in general that's alive in my spirit as well. And so while we have very, very different backgrounds, it's also that same internalized programming of just like what I often feel is I'm not doing enough, actually. And what you were touching on of like the hyper independence as well, which I think is a huge part of just like modernized culture, westernized culture, whiteness in general, like separation and like I'm gonna do it all on myself, on my own. It's alive in all of us, for sure. And I would love to ask you a little bit about like, you know, how have how have we been taught to approach work and business, especially, and like money and resources as women? Like, where do you see kind of like the roots of those things? Obviously, family is a big part of it, as you were saying. But can you speak to like all of the other realms that things are converging? I think that would be an interesting thing to touch on a little bit.
Ugh, what a good question. So I think that aspect of not enoughness is definitely something that permeates a lot of female experiences. It's really interesting because it's such a profound and prominent feeling. But I also want to share that, we didn't always exist like this. And when we kind of go back to work specifically, but we can really explore this from any angle, relationship dynamics and like the kind of polarity of masculine and feminine energetics that are present there. But just looking specifically at work, prior to the Industrial Revolution, we operated, and this is, of course, like after we've moved out of tribal communities in which everything was very much a collective experience, right? So women tended to their families together with other women, men fought and other tribes, right? Like there was a division of labor, but also a very communal essence of working together. And as we evolved into the era of agriculture, a lot of the time families now we're kind of shifting into like more family units. Family units still worked together and they divided the labor by and large, like within family units. And it was a very seasonal way of existing and working. The Industrial Revolution really started to shift that, like a little bit of history for everybody. And that is where factory work really started. And although we can kind of think that, oh, well, that was more of a male dominated system working in the factory, women in World War II were quite prominent in the factory as well. And so we really started to create a working style that A, optimized for efficiency, and that B, was led, a lot of the factories were ultimately led by male executives that defined some of these working rhythms, which were, Henry Ford coined the 40-hour work week. And that really started to shift how we thought about what productivity should look like as we shifted how we worked. And I can't say that there's like some sort of a massive conspiracy happening here. That's not really what I'm claiming, but we definitely never really had a place of consciously deciding as women started to shift into the workplace. How do we optimize for a feminine way of working, a way that is a bit more cyclical? We've disregarded seasons, which are inherently kind of mirrors of the feminine monthly cycle and feminine life cycle, by the way, which is like wild to consider. The maiden, mother, matriarch kind of crone. You can see that mirrored throughout seasons. You can see that mirrored over the course of our lifetimes, which is wild. We've disregarded all of that and we've really capitalized for the most productive seasons of spring and summer from a productivity kind of meta lens where we are constantly expected to output the same 365 days of the year. And women are expected to work in a way that doesn't really align with their biology. And so there is this complete disregard for feminine biology in our workplaces. But that also extends to a lot of feminine traits, right? Intuition is not exactly celebrated or capitalized on. The skill of empathy, which is quite important when it comes to building partnerships, the tend and befriend that women organically and naturally lean towards is disregarded. And as women, as we've shifted out of tending the home and into the workplace, we've just embodied characters of men in the workplace. And so what I see here is truly, I said this before, but like an untapped potential that we're leaving on the table. When we're ignoring how we operate as women, we are leaving behind the traits that can really help balance out society, the workplace, that can provide a an a true there's truly untapped potential on the table. And the last thing that I also want to mention about this too, and this is like a mega kind of thought that would be worth exploring, is that it's unfortunate, but women have, on a societal level, the same 15-year period of time to both excel at their career, find a partner if they want to do that, and have kids if they want to do that. Like, of course, if children are not in your plan, then that can obviously be delayed and changed. But it's really the same 15-year window, right? That window of our kind of looking over our lifetime, that spring and summertime of our seasonal lifetime is being leveraged for both excelling in career, finding a partner, and having kids. It's just truly not optimized for a balanced, easeful experience for women. And it's quite unfortunate.
Yeah. Thank you for all of that. A good history lesson to just like orient us in time and place. And that reminder that like this actually is not how 99.9% of our ancestors, particularly in our matrilineal legacy, like have actually experienced life. One, two, it was making me think about like my grandmother, who I love very dearly, who has passed on, who was brilliant in like every sense of the word. When she got into grad school, one of her professors said to her, he was like, he essentially said, I'm not going to take you seriously because you're just going to get pregnant and drop out, basically. Which my grandma is just as like fiery and stubborn as I am, and when she sets her mind to something, she just did it. And she was like, oh, absolutely not. I will be getting my degree, my master's, like 100%. And that's what she did. And in order to do that, she ended up going on birth control, which then there's like a whole thing that I could get into around birth control, but it's very much in alignment with what you just spoke to, which is like when we try to put women into the male-dominated world of business and of work outside of the home and productivity, they're essentially competing, one, for that, but they're also like trying to cram in so many different seasons of their life into that same period without any like reverence actually for the time of the life that they're walking through. And it ties into kind of the traditional Chinese medicine lens as well. I'm reading a really great book. I don't know if you're familiar with it, called Seven Times a Woman. Yeah.
So good. So good.
Yeah. Really, really good. Really beautiful. And I'm 28, and basically that book talks about how women go through these 7 year cycles of our lifetime. And in that book, it's like 28 to I think 34 or 35. Like that is a woman's childbearing season. That is when her health is actually the most vibrant. That is when she's able to show up for her family and for her health to actually be the most, um, I don't know, the word that's coming through is like voluptuous. Like that's like her season of true fertility. And that's also the season that we're like trying to force women into to advance their career. And it's a really intense thing to have to face. And when I was reading this book and all of my own questions about motherhood and what I want my life to look like and the season that I'm in and feeling guilty and feeling confused and feeling, like I'm not on track. And then I'm like, no, like this is the season where I'm only supposed to focus on that. Actually, like this is when I'm meant to come alive in that. And it's a short period of time as well. And so there's a lot of grief that comes up with that and a lot of confusion and a lot of pain. And I think a lot of women can relate to that feeling of just kind of like, how do I do it all? Am I supposed to do it all? Is it possible? And also like, how do I not create tons of health issues while doing it too, as well? I think that's big. Sorry, go ahead. You want to say something?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, you mentioned so many things, and it's it's just so one, I think something that I just want to reflect back is that grief and that feeling of competing priorities and feeling like maybe even overwhelmed by that, because like I can feel the overwhelm. I just want to share that I kind of want to normalize that reaction to the unrealistic standards that have been put forth. Like, I just full on name that because I think that and we're kind of coming out of this, but for the past 5 to 10 years, there was this narrative of, you know, lean in, you can do it all, you can have it all. And that's just truly unrealistic. Like Chinese medicine talks about the concept of, you know, when we burn the candle at both ends, we're just pulling from our savings account. We're pulling from our future selves. And that may show up in a hormonal imbalance 5 years from now, 2 years from now, immediately, 10 years from now. It might affect how we go through pregnancy or menopause or the health issues that we have after menopause. But the idea that there's this never ending source, and that's really where the mind over matter aspect comes in. Like, if we allow our brain and our minds to truly kind of no pain, no gain us through whatever it is we're trying to accomplish in that season of life. Of course, a little bit of work is needed in anything, like even birthing children, a lot of hard work, building a career, a lot of hard work. But I think it's important for us to also be honest with ourselves as women, and that's the very first step to understanding that the expectations that we can have it all at once are just not realistic. And it is an inconvenient truth that something will suffer. And one of the things, I think that there is an upside. We could talk about, well, what do we do with this, right? So I don't want it to have to sound all negative, but I do think it is important to ground with that and to experience the grief of that too, because our society tells us these are the milestones and this is what it looks like and these are the time frames and this is what success looks like. And I just want us to really take a look and see, is that what we want for our lives, and to choose from there as opposed to just getting on the hamster wheel and rolling until it's later in our lives, and we look back and we're like, wow, how did we make these decisions that really harmed our bodies and our maybe future outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for speaking to that. And I think Something I think about a lot is that traditional Chinese medicine says women's bodies are 10 times harder to heal, actually, because of the intricacy of our hormonal matrix. And because also our hormonal matrix is one that takes an entire menstrual cycle to essentially like come back to a reset place, which is our bleed, right? Whereas men have that built-in reset every 24 hours. And so there's also just that reality that women really have to tend to ourselves in a way that's different from men. Men need to tend to themselves too, but the degree of nourishment and nurturance and self-care and just protecting our life force energy and restoring our life force energy, it's a non-negotiable actually, because especially when we look at our culture, when we look at then a lot of women ending up wanting to get pregnant in like their early 30s or even their mid 30s and realizing like, wow, all of the um, forcing that I did to myself, all of the like drive and push and like unrelenting energy and lack of rest and lack of care that I offered to myself and my health and my spirit, like it's showing up right now, one. But then we also see that postpartum. Postpartum in many cultures, but we're talking about traditional Chinese medicine, is called like a golden window of opportunity when that's actually a period when a woman can not only resolve all of the health issues that she's experienced in her life up until that point, but can also essentially prevent any future health issues if she has like a really, really supported and loving postpartum. And that's also something that we don't have in our culture as well because we're expected to go back to work immediately, you know? Like I've heard of people who have to be at work like the next week or maybe even the next day or like 4 weeks, and that is not nearly enough time. So like the lack of reverence for just a woman's body and the extremes that she goes to and the other realms that her spirit stretches into and reaches towards, and then just expecting her to be able to like, go right back into it after such profound initiations, not just after a birth that results in a live child, but through miscarriage, through abortion, through fertility journeys, all of that kind of stuff. There's no space for that.
So good. I'm so glad that you brought this up because I feel so passionate about this. It is as though we are at the precipice of really, it's like I think that this is like the next revolution that needs to happen, which is really a revolution of lifting back up. And this is what I love that you're doing, Claire, as well. And this is why I love your podcast. But it is a re-remembrance, a re-celebration, a lifting back up of the feminine and all the qualities that go with that. It is a cyclical way of life. It is a nurturing quality as well. It is a the reverence of the qualities of the tending and befriending, the caretaking, the life creating that we truly are currently on a highway away from, frankly, right? Even I don't even want to go here, but like, the fast-paced, constant output of AI that is reactive versus going deeper within and creative from like a depth place, right? We are missing that. We are truly, if you kind of speaking of Chinese medicine and thinking about the symbol of the Taiji, the yin and the yang, when we have an overabundance of one, and by the way, there's a seed of yin within yang, and there's a seed of yang within yin. And even though the symbol of the Taiji is shown as there's the light and the dark, one representing yin, the other one representing yang, in reality, they're actually meant to be in constant motion. So you cannot distinguish between the two, which kind of goes back to the concept of non-duality, which you see in Buddhism and in Taoism, which is just so beautiful. And it represents the balance that is found on a balanced, healthy earth environment of which we are a part of. But when we have one out of balance energetic, in this case, yang out of balance, the doing. It is the fire without rain. You have wildfires. And that is truly, symbolically what we see in nature, not just symbolically and literally what we see in nature is happening to us as well. That is not when you are in the midst of a fire, if you're in the midst of burnout, literally, that is not a state, or healing from burnout for that matter, because it does take a while to heal from that. That is not a state that perpetuates fertility, creation, and health and balance. It is a state of recovery after that burnout. And so I just love that you mentioned really bringing back that reverence and the celebration of what the feminine represents. That is what we as women can do and start to do. And also, of course, the men who support this. It's really powerful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I mean, it's so funny. Yin Yang is like really, really big in my consciousness right now. I don't know if you know Kiddush of it's now called the Holy Well. It was called the Womb Room. I just released an episode with her actually. But she within her how to explain what the Holy Well is. It's like it's an online how does she refer to it? Church, school, and like community basically. She teaches very deep in like womb consciousness work. But she goes deep into yin yang, and something that I love a lot about Taoist philosophy is that it's very deeply interwoven into a lot of the indigenous teachings that I carry from my elders in the Colombian jungle is like everything that we need to be tending to inside of us, we can look to nature to teach us, right? And like what you just mentioned of when you have too much fire without any rain, you get a whole wildfire. You know, you get an entire forest burning down. And that's what happens within us as well. And so I feel that a lot of this like re-remembering, right? And bringing that ancestral wisdom back into our bodies in this moment right now. You don't have to read books. You don't have to like go to grad school. You know, you don't have to do what you and I are doing of like really, really deep dive. Like you can actually go and just look at what happens in nature and see that as the immediate reflection of what's going on in us internally as well. Um, I'd love to kind of take that and segue it into like we've spoken a lot about the impacts that going against your female hormonal matrix has on physical health. But I would also really love to hear you speak to like the impacts that it has on an emotional level, on a mental level, on a spiritual level, in our relationships, all of that kind of stuff. Like when we are burning ourselves so much, when we are burning ourselves out so much at work, what does that do to just the rest of our life force, energy, and the cosmology and constellation of our life?
Such a beautiful question. Well, I will speak in two parts here. I think that one, looking at the feminine, and this is for women who are bleeding right now, but feminine menstrual cycle as not just a combination of physiological changes and hormones, which it is, but an ebb and flow of energy that can really translate to our own energy within. Well, within it is happening within us. And by the way, this also is present in the seasons too, right? Like the ebb and flow of winter through to spring and summer, the changes of that energy. We can feel the energy rising versus, rising in the spring and the summer and then dwindling in the autumn and the winter. All of that is happening within our bodies. And I mention that because if you are currently a menstruating woman, and you might be in a different season of life. Perhaps you're postpartum and breastfeeding, in which case you will likely not have a cycle, but that is kind of your extended winter period, for lack of a better word, or you might be in a different phase of being perimenopause or menopausal, where there might be some changes. But just looking at the menstrual cycle, and we can talk about the spiritual ways of connecting to that rhythm if you don't bleed as well. But looking at the menstrual cycle or even the cycles of the moon, there is this ebbing and flowing that takes place. And on a spiritual level, one of the profound things that I have noticed in tuning into living in a more cyclical way is that I find that energy and intuition are oftentimes inversely related, meaning that as energy is high, the peak of spring and summer, that is a time when sometimes our intuition might feel a little bit harder to connect to. We don't always notice that because our energy is so outward. But when our energy turns inward around the ends of our cycles, or when we are starting our bleed, when we start our bleed after a few days, it starts to rise again. But these are times of profound intuition. And I really want to reframe that for people because everyone always focuses on the ovulatory time, the middle of our cycle, after our bleed into the middle of our cycle as being this Beyonce season, and you feel great and you're confident. And that might be true for some women, yes, and that's all great. But if we don't also show the same reverence for the period of dwindling that happens, the period of autumn and winter seasonally, the periods of the new moon or the waning into new moon that we or waxing into new moon, I think. I'm messing that up, but the period right before the new moon, you might know better. Claire, you can correct me.
Waning. Waning is when we're
Waning.
waxing is when we're coming into full.
Yes. Okay. So the waning into the new moon, when we are experiencing those times, that is also a time where our intuition will come out. It might come out in the form of our shadow selves, which need tending to and leaning towards. And if we only lean towards the bright, bubbly, confident, productive sides of us, we are ignoring the wealth and depth of wisdom that then can inform the outward, right? So if we ignore what comes in from the depths, the inner parts of us that come up in the quote unquote PMS phase before we get our periods, then we are again just turning our faces, turning our hearts away, and only celebrating the outward yang type of energy. And so, from a spiritual side, I want to share that there's a powerful reframe that can happen here when we start to tune into the seasons within, the seasons outside of us, and we can really celebrate that on a monthly basis. May it be with our bleeds, with the cycles of the moon, the cycles of the seasons, but there is an ebb and flow that is present, and even the darker, shadowy sides that come up are gifts. They tell us about the parts of ourselves that need some tending to. And when we tend to those, we can learn so much. A lot of women will share, myself included, that I will often experience right before my bleed this tension, this friction, perhaps some negative self talk come out. And if I turn towards the parts of myself that are experiencing that are coming up with those emotions, I oftentimes notice a clearing that comes with my bleed. And then again, there's room for new creativity and creation. And I think that's so powerful. Every single one of us has that within us.
Thank you. Thank you for that reframe. And it was connecting me to what we were speaking a lot about at the beginning, before we pressed record around the liminal spaces that you and I are both in our lives right now. And it was making me think about how immensely grateful I am that I have really healed a lot of my relationship with my cycle and especially with my bleed, mostly because of all of the time that I spent in the jungle and the way in which my elders and the community that I was living in, like the reverence that they held for the heightened intuition that comes with the premenstrual time and the bleeding time. Like in a traditional context, you don't sit in a medicine ceremony. You don't drink ayahuasca when you're bleeding because you're already in ceremony. And there's a lot of indigenous lineages from all over the world where the women would go into like the moon lodge or their red tent or whatever version of a women's space, a bleeding space. And they would be in prayer and they would be in meditation to connect to all of the things that their community needed to work out. And they would come out of those women's lodges and they would go to the elders and they would say, this is what we learned during our time bleeding, because that hemisphere between the two sides of our brain literally like dissolves during our bleed. We're in a complete altered state of consciousness and our brain is working at like a level that is inaccessible any other time. But I think hearing that really beautiful reframe that you just offered helped me recognize how coming into right relationship with my bleed and those times of my cycle that are usually, um, honestly, I would say degraded. Actually, when I think about PMS, when I think about being a young girl, oh, she's PMSing kind of thing. Actually, no, I'm moving into deep, deep intuition. And yes, there might be anger there, actually. There might be severe bitchiness, actually. There might be like real things that have to shift. And there might be tension that needs to be addressed as well. And when I see that in like this very liminal phase of my life that I'm in right now, where I do feel big deaths and big endings and no clear beginning in sight and a lot of stuff transforming and very out of control. The work that I've done with my bleed, I'm seeing now, has like oriented me towards being in the depth of that darkness and being okay, actually, and honoring that deep yin phase, not just of my cycle, but of my life right now. I'm in a really deep yin phase, and it's scary. It's scary to have to go so deep into surrender. It's scary to have to go so deep into gentleness. It's scary to have to go so deep into like the expansiveness of the unknown, but that's the yin. And that's that whole part of our cycle that is not, doesn't receive reverence, really. So thank you. I feel really like, okay, I can do it. I can make it through.
Oh man, well, my heart goes out to you because we briefly talked about kind of what's happening. I mean, it's so intense. There's this meditation teacher that I love, Buddhist teacher called Deborah Eden Toll, and she wrote a book called Luminous Darkness, which talks about exactly this, how the liminal spaces that we're in our lives are actually spaces of fertile ground. It's like the ground before you can see the first bud come out, right? Like it's deep, deep, deep in there. But I mean, it is courageous to be there. It's so funny because it's not funny, haha, but it's interesting because we all are changing. We talked about this right before this, but like we're always in transition, but sometimes it's just more obvious than others. But when it is really obvious, it's so uncomfortable. I'm curious, how have you been practicing surrender, and has it been like that push pull of the mind versus like the body, just like letting go? I mean, how do you navigate that? Because I know that you also talked about being between the age of like, you just turned 28 recently, right? Like not too long ago. And wait, in September you turned 28?
No, so last summer. So I'm coming up
Last
on,
summer.
yeah.
Coming up on 20. Oh my gosh, Saturn return. Wow. Okay. Ah, so it's like such a space of, so many shifts are happening at once and you're in this like liminal space. Like I'm curious what's coming up for you during this time and like how are you navigating it, practically speaking?
Yeah, when I came back to the States after being in the jungle for so long, and yahe was my tool, ayahuasca was my tool, and other tools, my creativity, my beading work that I do, my music, my paintings, my drawings, movement, dance, all of that was very available to me. And then I came back to the States and I was broke and I had no money. That's why I had to come back. I had no money, and I was like, oh my God, I have to not be broke. And went into that phase of like push, push, go, go, go. I'm just gonna make a ton of money and then I'll be out of here again and I'll be back on my path, and got really burnt out and it didn't work. And actually the money didn't stay. Actually, all of the money that that I made still like left, because I wasn't in peace. actually, really, at the end of the day, I wasn't in peace. And I had to really sit down with myself after I came back from the jungle. And it was right when we decided we were going to do an interview. And I was like, okay, I can't do this interview until I really like just get kind of right with myself and slow down. Like very seriously slow down and accept that I'm a woman who has to honor the medicine of womanhood and who has to honor the season in her life right now that is really hard. And it's so intense, like what I'm going through right now in so many realms of my life. It is like one of the hardest initiations I've ever been through, even after the hundreds of cups of ayahuasca I've drank. Like, it's very hard. And because of that, I have to be so soft. I have to be so quiet. I have to go and walk in the woods by my parents' home in silence and just be with the dead trees. I have to like tend to my body every single day, especially when I really don't want to. I have to nourish myself with really loving, beautiful food that makes me feel good. I have to pray like the hardest I've ever prayed in my life to like give up all of the control because I've done the thing where I've tried to force for 28 years, you know, and it doesn't work. And so I have a lot of different practices, I think, that are helping me move into this like midwifing of my Saturn return and this next chapter of my life that I have no idea how it's going to unfold. But yeah, just like really, really constantly being in this state of like, what does softness mean? What does it mean to cultivate peace in myself so that I can actually be of service in the way that I want to in the world? How do I really, really honor what it means to be a woman and to ripple serenity in my life? Like I'm barely scratching the surface with it. I'm just now kind of recognizing like, oh, that's what I really actually just want is just serenity. And how do I do that? Like I have to surrender. There's no way to do it. You just stop doing everything else.
Stop the fighting against the currents of the river. Oh my gosh. Claire, my heart goes out to you so much. I mean, it's so difficult because I know you're getting hit with it from like all facets of life right now, which is so difficult. And it's so interesting because even the liminal periods, at least for me, feel they're like seasons, but we don't know how long they're going to last. It's like, how long will the winter last? Unclear, right? And there is that period of uncertainty, and I can so relate to that, kind of currently being in a period between what feels like life and death with my mom who's really sick, and then also trying to birth new life, being on a fertility journey, having that not go as I logically planned, and then having that this is just another liminal space, and I feel like when I reflect on other liminal spaces in my life, like career change moments, which came with so much havoc and discomfort, going from making money to making no money and spending money on a grad school program and trying to make that happen, to then, maybe like the period before that, which was, the breakups, the massive breakups that like upheavaled my life and took away my closest relationships to me and moved me. And then those were just these seasons of liminality that now when I look back at them, I'm like, oh my gosh, they were perspective shifting and they brought into my life something I would have never considered. And I even think about for you too, it's so interesting because you've done so much work and continue to plan to do so much work, like in the jungle. But also, you have such a unique position of being like a bridge between two worlds in that way, right? Like you come from the United States, like you're based here, and yet you can spend the time in the exploration, the inner exploration. And then now you've like built up some of the tools to bring you into facing this crazy initiation. But who knows what it'll look like after that? And like, there's just, I mean, it almost feels like there's this need for you to be here in this space right now. And like, you've had so much of that training to get you here. I don't know. That was like a mouth vomit of thoughts all at once.
No, but it's true, and I'm just laughing because I'm like, and that's also the medicine of the feminine is the like constant change. You know, when we think about the masculine, when we think about the yang, there's this clear direction, the master of time, this like linear direction that you can hold on to. And there are times when we can access that because as you were speaking, when we talk about the yin yang and the figure that we always see is like it's separated, but you're saying it's actually always in transition, and that's how nature works. And we do carry yang energy within us as women. It's not something that we need to like totally shut down, like the masculine side of us that creates structure and that creates stability and that creates a clear through line and a plan and organization. But also at the end of the day, like the polarity that the pole that we lean towards more is going to be that yin. And it's going to be that like only God knows what magic is going to come from these spaces of darkness. And it was interesting because when you were sharing with me kind of the liminal space that you're in right now of like moving through a very intense moment with your mother and dealing with stage 4 cancer and who knows who knows what comes with that, right? And then also being on the other side of like wanting to bring life into this world. I feel like we're always experiencing that in some way, in some capacity. And I think it's beautiful too to see someone who is a little bit older than me, a few years down the line, who has done different work than I've done and who has experienced the things that she's experienced, and to see that like liminal phases are always just as uncomfortable. You know, they never get easier. We just become like a little bit more equipped to move through it, hopefully with grace, right? And I'm like, everything that we're talking about is all just coming back to me or for me to like, how do we navigate that well? Well, we have to be listening to our wombs. And how do we listen to our wombs? Like, there's so much work to be done. And so I think maybe I'd love to kind of wrap things up with this part of the interview by asking you, you know, how do women even begin this work? If you're like at the very, very beginning of developing a relationship with your womb, with your intuition, with your feminine, with that side of you that has maybe been, you know, lying dormant, that has been degraded and disrespected and silenced by maybe people in your life, by maybe your family, by the culture that we live in. And you're listening to this episode and you're like, well, then what do I do? You know? Because that's also our response. We want to take on the masculine. I have to do something, you know? I'd love to hear your perspective of like how to even soften into the very first step with all of this because it's so big and it ripples through not just our bodies and our cells and potentially our descendants, but it like reaches back at least 7 generations. That's what so many different cross-cultural lineages speak to, the 7 generations that we heal when we heal ourselves. So how do we soften? How do we start?
Such a good question. So, the first thing that I want to offer for any women listening to this is to start with your monthly bleed. If you are bleeding currently, especially if I mean, if you're on birth control, you can do this as well. We won't get into the biology of it unless you want me to go there, but just tune into start to tune into your body, starting with your bleed. Like, it is the most beautiful way to do it. I would like to offer, without getting into, cycle syncing and how that works, just starting by day one of your bleed, lean into how are you feeling and tune into what is your energy like, and start to take small steps as much as you can to listen to that. And it can be simple, right? Where if you're listening to this and you're a mother and you work full time and you're like, okay, that's a little esoteric for me, it could be simple that day. It could be perhaps asking your partner to pick up a little bit more of the load because you just started bleeding, or perhaps sleeping in and skipping your workout that day. Tune into the energy within your body. That is the most powerful way to do it. And observe how it shifts and changes over the course of your cycle. Everyone's cycle is going to look different. Some cycles are 28 days, some are 34 days, or 32 days. Some are a little bit shorter, especially if you're going through perimenopause. You might notice that fluctuating and changing. And so really attuning to your energy over the course of your cycle, and start to honor that. That is like one of the best ways to do it. And I'd like to offer two tips because I think the other one is also very important. We talked a lot on this podcast about how our bodies are really interconnected with nature. And another beautiful way to tune into some of these cyclical rhythms is to tune into the cyclical changes in nature. If you are in a part of the world where it's like the tail end of winter and you notice spring coming through, how can you connect with that every single day? The pace of the earth is slow, it is supported. It is something that we have the ability to connect to wherever we are. And so, may it be our earthly bodies or the earth itself, these are two options of ways that you can just attune to a different, more visceral, physical, energetic pace. And I think that they're both very, very supportive, and just tools to start. That is like the simplest thing that I would love to offer for anyone listening out there.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I was thinking about, it's when we just take like that one small step, just like what you mentioned, like just asking someone to take on a little bit more of the load and saying, I'm actually really tired right now. I actually really need to rest, even if it's just for 20 minutes, right? 10 minutes, 5 minutes. But really being honest with where we're at so that people can show up for us and respond in that way. The masculine also really feeds off of that vulnerability. Any kind of polarity teachings will share like when the yin is really in the full truth of the moment of like this is what is real and true. The masculine is nourished by that because then it understands, oh, that's where I need to direct things, right? And that's not just applicable for relationships with men because we all hold that masculine and feminine. Being able to give people the opportunity to show up for you in those moments is pivotal because it also sets the stage for then what is your postpartum going to look like when you really, really need support? Like, how have you practiced using your voice? How have you practiced understanding true honesty in yourself? Being vulnerable in the amount of support that you need, because then that's also applicable throughout your entire parenting journey as well. That's going to be applicable when you move into perimenopause, into menopause, like all of it sets the stage. And so when I look at kind of the domino effect that just one single moment of saying, like, how am I really feeling right now on my bleed? Or the days before my bleed, like what's really coming up for me? you're time traveling. You're reaching into the future and like creating kind of when you were talking about like the candle burning on both ends, like you're like adding a little bit more wax to your candle and giving yourself more vibrancy, more light, more spaciousness, more life force, truly. That's how deep this work goes.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
I'm laughing because I'm like, we didn't even talk about we didn't even talk about work, really, but it's also funny too. We didn't talk about productivity. We didn't talk about aligning with the cycles. But I'm also kind of like, do we need to at all? I don't know. Do you feel like that's something that we should touch on a little bit?
Mm. Well, we can definitely get into it, and kind of give women a framework, high level framework of the different seasons in their bodies. I think that can be really supportive. Um, but let me know, because I know that also you mentioned right before we started recording how a lot of the cycle syncing language can be very prescriptive. And I think that there is like a high level framework in the same way that we can understand the difference between winter or the height of summer, um, that can be really helpful for people. So we can definitely get into it. I can talk about that.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to talk about both that as well as something that you touched on earlier of like what are really the feminine gifts that like that untapped potential that's being left on the table for our everyday lives, but especially when we're showing up in a work context that we're like not utilizing at all as women. I think those two things would be really
Mm,
to, to round everything out, round the
I
conversation out.
love that. I love that. So, to get a little more practical for those who want to go deeper beyond just tracking their energy over the course of their cycle, which I think can be a really beautiful place to start. It's very simple. And it's also, our bleed can be such a milestone over the course of our month as, okay, this is the beginning of a new cycle. There is, of course, seasonality within our cycle that I think can be really helpful, a really helpful framework, right? And that is that within our cycle, we really have four, and they're not distinct, they're just four phases. The way you would experience seasons within your body, or sorry, within Mother Earth, we have them within our bodies as well. So at the start of our bleed, we are in our winter season. And then, of course, we move into spring and then summer and then autumn. And these are also called the menstrual, follicular, ovulatory, and luteal phases. And these four phases have a they will look very different in terms of what day do they hit for every different person because everyone's cycle is unique. And so as I dive into kind of sharing about them, I think the one thing that I just want to name before I even talk about the different seasons or phases is that take this as a high level framework and customize it to your body. And I'm purposefully not going to mention any specific dates except for the beginning of our cycle and at the end, because each season might come earlier or later for each individual, depending on their experience. And that is very, very natural. And one of the things that I find is to be very important is to see what it feels like for you. So, the menstrual phase or the inner winter is the start of our cycle. It starts on day one of our bleed. If you have spotting that happens kind of before your bleed, it's day one of needing to take action, meaning you need to grab for a pad or a cup. This is really the start of our menstrual phase. And from a productivity standpoint, when we're thinking about tips, this is a time where energy is low, very, very low. Our intuition is actually quite high. A lot of women will share that they have breakthroughs, especially after their, the end of their last cycle. Breakthroughs might come through during this time. This is a powerful time for reflection. In my own personal work, and I'll share some real practical experiences, these are times when I look at how can I optimize either workflows or if I'm shipping a product, like what can I change in terms of product definitions during this time, because I have a lot more clarity to reflect on things with a bit more discernment. This is not a time where I schedule a lot of high profile meetings. I try not to schedule my own podcast interviews. I move those to just even a couple of days after my cycle starts, whenever possible, because I know my energy is going to be a bit more outward. This is a very reflective time, and this is a time of nourishment. So, the warm, nourishing foods that you might imagine during winter can be very supportive during this time. So that is a brief overview of that first season. And maybe a few days, might be, a couple of days, might be 5 days for some other women. That is when we transition into spring. Now, physiologically during winter, our hormones are at their lowest. It's estrogen is at its lowest, and it starts to rise in the spring and really peaks during the summer season, inner season that we experience. So again, from kind of more sciencey terms, we're moving from menstrual into the spring, which is known as follicular, and then ovulatory is the summer seasons. And this is really where we might notice bursts of energy. This is so similar to what we see in nature, the buds coming through of the flowers when they're blooming. I just went for a walk before we started recording, and it's inspiring, it's colorful. There's like an attunement that happens there. This is a very powerful time from a productivity point of view to lean into that creativity. This is where bringing up problems that felt impossible to solve in the luteal phase you might come up with new ideas during this time. This is oftentimes a time where I like to, practically speaking, prototype or ideate around different projects that I'm working on, because new ideas will come through and I start to notice that things just like flow. I'm in a flow state. If I'm recording a solo podcast, I'll do it during this phase or into the ovulatory phase, just because my ideas flow so well. I have limitless ideas for what to write about, right? Because I know you have a Substack. So this is a very creative time. From the food point of view, this is also where we want to start to nourish ourselves with some fresh, vibrant foods, especially foods that start to lean into the cruciferous category, so that estrogen is rising. And we want to make sure that we have foods that are supportive in eliminating any excess estrogen during this time. And you can also kind of think, as we kind of take this journey of energy, there's a translation here to workouts too. So menstrual phase is rest, but the spring or follicular phase, this is a time where you can kind of pick up some of the workouts and the movements, some more strength training, maybe starting some jogging. And as you transition into the next phase, which is the height of summer or the ovulatory phase, this is the phase that we advertise. Okay. This is the Beyonce phase. This is the phase that all of our marketing campaigns capitalize on, right? I mean, well, actually, sometimes they also capitalize on the luteal phase, but most of them are really advertising. If you buy this product, right, you will feel like your inner Beyonce. This is what we celebrate. These are the more productive, outward, energetic states in our bodies. This is a great phase to be outward. This is a time for pitching. This is a time for high profile guest interviews for your podcast, right? Between the spring and the summer, a great time to really be outward. This is a time where I will prioritize sales pitches for my product, going out, talking to retailers, talking to Revolve, talking to in-person retailers, because I feel a bit more outward. By the way, I also will mention this is, we can kind of reflect on if there are any times of month where you notice that imposter syndrome is a lot louder. Just notice for yourself if that is transient, right? Because around this phase is usually, in my own experience, kind of in the height of summer, the ovulatory phase, where I feel so much more confident. And I remember that when I go into some of the later phases that we're going to talk about in a second. This is a time where high intensity workouts are going to feel a whole lot better. And there's actually science behind this too. I know we're talking a lot about energetics, but when estrogen is high, it's actually quite protective to the muscle. And there's research that shows that It is protective against injury, which is why high intensity workouts are better during this time. It is also it also helps with strength gains. So if you are doing strength workouts, the first half of your cycle, you will notice more strength gains than the second half of your cycle. And that ovulatory phase, kind of where the estrogen is at its peak before it starts to decline, marks the height of that. And so if you've ever heard some of the languaging around, this is a great time to do high intensity workouts or strength workouts, dance, things that are higher energy, this is why. And that's a perfect segue to the end of our seasons, which is the luteal phase. And the date that this will be different for every woman. Again, this is why tracking your energy is so powerful. For me, I actually do notice a very distinctive shift about 4 days before my cycle where I'm like, oof, I'm in a different phase. And some people might say that there are 2 phases to the luteal cycle, right? But we won't even get that complicated. But the first part of the luteal cycle, you might still have a lot more energy, but just know that hormonally things are shifting. Progesterone starts to rise in the second half of your cycle. It is really the star hormone during that time. And it is at odds with cortisol, which is another reason why you don't want to push yourself too hard during this phase, because it can throw things off balance. If you are doing workouts that are intense, that stress you out, if you are pushing yourself beyond your capacity during this time and it stresses you out, it will start to adjust the hormonal balance, especially adjust that balance of progesterone, which is quite important because a lot of women tend to be estrogen dominant in our society. A lot of the products that we consume both outside of our bodies, such as lotions and perfumes, and the foods that we eat, have a lot of estrogen-like properties to them that we consume. And because of that, we notice a lot of estrogen dominance in a lot of women. And so that, coupled with the excess stress, can throw progesterone off. So again, we're in that final phase, the autumn, the luteal phase. This is where starting to take it easy is so important, not just for hormonal balance, but because you also, if you kind of remember to what we talked about earlier, that inverse relationship between energy and intuition, you have access to a brief window of time as a woman where the shadow sides of yourself, of your environment will start to come up. And turning towards that can offer such an opportunity to do some healing. May it be journaling, may it be meditation, just starting to really lean towards that discomfort. It will prepare you for the clarity and the washing that comes with a new cycle. Now, from a productivity point, what does this look like? Now, it's incredible. There's so much research that now supports how the brain shifts over the course of a cycle. And the luteal phase is actually a time where there's a lot of focus energy. This is also a very nesting energy. A lot of women may experience kind of that desire to tidy things up in the household before their cycle comes because we are innately wired to want to nest before we rest. Now, this can also be applied to productivity. This is a time to clear up the to-do list, do some deep focus work. I noticed that my attention is much more focused in the luteal phase, not right before my cycle, not like the few days before my cycle, but in general, after I ovulate, a couple of days out, I have that focused energy and I capitalize on it. And so after the luteal phase, another cycle begins and we're in the menstrual phase again. And you asked a really good question, Claire, which is like, what is that untapped potential? Like, what do you mean by that, right? Like, what do I mean by that when I talk about that? And I think it really comes into play when we think about, as women, when we ignore this ebb and flowing of our energy, we are missing out on moments of increased creativity, increased productivity, increased focus, a moment where we can see things from a different angle during our luteal phase, where we can reflect on things differently and optimize during our menstrual phase. If we treat every day like it is the height of summer, not only are we physiologically burning our bodies out, but we are missing out on kind of optimized times of the month to be creative, to be more productive. And instead, when we lean into those times, we might notice that there are certain days during our ovulatory phase or our follicular phase. So, again, the spring and the summer seasons, where we have 12 hours worth of energy and we're just plowing through it and it's effortless and it's fluid and we're loving it and we're feeling juicy about it. And then we have times of the month where we just need to rest and go inward, and suddenly that kind of plants the seeds for new budding and new creativity. And when we ignore that and we try to apply a 12-hour framework every single day of the week, because that is how industrialized societies have taught us to work. And frankly, men are optimized for that because they don't have this ebb and flow. They have a 24-hour cycle that refreshes every single day. We miss out on our own potential as women. And that's really where that untapped potential lies.
So much good information. I think it's a really, really helpful, clear, concise overview, especially for anyone who might be hearing this for like the very first time. But even for me, I mean, I've been deep in this work for years now at this point, and it's so funny how easy it is to forget or to dishonor or to push aside those times that are really, yeah, optimized, I guess, is like the perfect word, to step into those different sides of ourselves that can do this and that can do this and that can do this. And as you were kind of wrapping up, I was just thinking about something that I heard that I think just is true for the entire lifespan of a woman, which is, um, we can do everything. Women can do everything, just not all at the same time. And I think that that's what I've been thinking about a lot throughout this entire conversation is just like the expansiveness of a woman's life and how to honor all of those seasons. And that starts with honoring our cycle because our cycle is like our it's our blueprint of our life, truly, at the end of the day. So I think it's a really cool place to wrap up. I want to give you a little bit of space to just share about your projects, your offerings, what you're doing in the world, ways people can connect with you. Yeah, just go ahead. And any closing notes that you want to offer as well to people.
Well, thank you so much. This is such a joy. I feel like I've known you for years now, so I love that. Well, as you mentioned, I host a podcast. It's called The Other Way, and we cover a lot of these topics, but really from different angles. So one of the things that I'm really passionate about this year is exploring both the science, the spirituality, the relational, the productive aspects of the female world, and really working towards not just understanding, where are we going wrong as a society and what can we do, but also what can we do about it, right? Like how can we solve that? And to really offer women a space to explore paths less traveled. So that's kind of like the thesis that I have for 2025. And I'm bringing on some great guests really focused around that, exploring it from all angles: spirituality, motherhood, fertility, death, like every single angle of the female experience. I also have Inflow, which is a planner and a journal really committed to translating some of what I talked about. Even though I've spent most of my career in software, I intentionally created something that is physical because things happen in the mind when we write things down and when we take that moment to reflect. And Inflow is really a planner that is designed to help women connect with their bodies every single day. It is a tool to help us really customize our productivity and our schedules to work with our bodies. So it's something that you don't just do first thing in the morning. You can take it with you, and it starts on day one of your cycle, not a random Monday. And so it's really personalized for women. And so, yeah, those are the two things that I'm offering. The best way to connect with me is either via inflowplanner.com, which is where the planner is, or head to the podcast, which is the Other Way podcast.
Well, I will link both of those in the show notes. And it was funny when you were talking about the planner, I was like, oh my God, it's the perfect yang structure to create the space for the yin to like be full and held. And it's something that I think a lot of women, when they get into polarity work and they're like, I just want to be in my feminine, I'm not planning anything. It's like, well, actually, you do need that structure. You do need that inner yang. You need to cultivate it so that the yin has the spaciousness. And so now I'm like, oh man, I need to get back on my cycle journaling. I've totally been off and now I'm super excited. So I think I'm going to order my own. I'll put it in the show notes and everything. Thank you so much for coming onto the show and for sharing so many beautiful parts of your own path and also asking a lot of beautiful questions as well. That was very much joyful for me to kind of have a dialogue going back and forth. And for those of us who are listening and who are subscribed to the Substack, we're going to have a very different conversation all about God. I want to ask Kasia about this monk that she keeps seeing in the and like all this other stuff and something that we talked about before we started recording of just like how beautiful spirituality is and also like how annoying it can kind of be sometimes and the consumerism and the capitalism and social media and all of the layers to it that we're kind of mixed up in these days and how do we just identify what truth is for us and how do we cut through all the nonsense and just get back to like what our relationship is with God. So I'm excited to see how that's gonna turn out. That'll be on Substack for you guys. It'll be linked in the show notes. So thank you so much, Kasia. This was awesome.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Cool. Thank you guys. Mm-hmm.